In March of 2015, 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova was having renovations done to her home in St. Petersburg, Russia. A friend of hers, 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, had heard about Tamara's renovations, and she approached her and said, "Do you want to stay with me while that's getting done?" Tamara was very thankful, immediately said yes, and as soon as she moved in, she immediately started picking up the slack by cleaning up the house and doing the dishes, and made sure she always cooked food for her friend because she wasn't able to pay rent. After a couple of weeks, the renovations on Tamara's home were complete, but Tamara didn't want to leave. She was really enjoying living with Valentina, and so she asked Valentina would it be okay if she stayed a little bit longer. Valentina was a little bit reluctant, but did ultimately say, okay, that's fine. A couple of months go by, and Tamara is showing no sign that she plans on leaving Valentina's home anytime soon, and Valentina is getting increasingly frustrated with that reality. Finally, in late July 2015, Valentina confronts Tamara and says, "You gotta go." And Tamara just says, "No, I'm not leaving." This causes a huge fight, but at the end of it, Tamara still doesn't leave. So for a couple of days, the women just do not speak to each other. The silence is finally broken on July 23rd when the women get into a fight about some empty cups in the sink that one of them was supposed to clean, but they didn't. And they fought about whose responsibility it was to do the dishes. And then of course, the whole subject comes up again of Valentina saying, "You shouldn't even be here, you need to leave." And Tamara's like, "No, I'm not gonna leave." And so another big blowout fight happens. But at the end of this fight, Tamara finally concedes and says, "Okay, I get it. I need to leave. Just give me a couple of days and I'll be out of your hair." Immediately, the tension is gone in the room. They're no longer fighting. And Valentina is happy that she's finally going to get her apartment back. And Tamara says, "Look, I'll make us dinner tonight. I'll go out and get some food." Tamara leaves the apartment and goes to a pharmacy and gets a whole bunch of sleeping pills. And then she gets the ingredients to a particular salad that she knows Valentina really likes. She goes back, she starts making dinner. And as she's making this salad, she crushes up the sleeping pills and mixes the powder with the salad dressing and gives that to Valentina. And Valentina, who's very hungry, eats the whole salad and doesn't notice anything is wrong. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had eaten the entire salad, Tamara just goes up to her room and goes to bed. A couple hours later, at about 2 in the morning, she goes back down to the kitchen and she sees Valentina is passed out on the ground. Tamara goes up to her and sees that she's still breathing, which was a disappointment because she wanted her to die from taking all these sleeping pills, but it doesn't matter. She takes out her hacksaw that she had borrowed from the neighbor earlier in the day and proceeds to butcher Valentina. And she makes special care as she's cutting her into pieces to remove her lungs and not damage them, because Tamara had a taste for human lungs. It was actually her favorite food. She took Valentina's head and she put it into a big pot of water and began boiling that to eat it. The rest of her was cut up into as small of pieces as she could get them and then wrapped in a shower curtain and placed in various bags. As Valentina's head and lungs are being cooked on the stovetop, Tamara begins making dozens of trips from the apartment down the stairs, out the front door, all the way down to the lake that was near their property, where she would dispose of the body parts before coming back and getting more. Valentina's hips and legs were apparently too heavy to haul all the way down to the lake, so she took them to a nearby forest. Tamara's final trip sees her carrying a big silver pot, inside of which is Valentina's head, or at least whatever is left of it after Tamara was done eating most of it. 4 days later, on July 27th, a young couple that was living in the same apartment complex as Tamara and Valentina were out for a walk with their dog out near that lake. And as they're walking, their dog takes off running and stops in front of this huge bag that it's sniffing and pawing and trying to open. And the owners of the dog try to call it back, but they can't get it to get away from this bag. And so the owners walk over and they kind of poke the bag. They can see it's pretty heavy, and they open it up and they find a human torso, and it's Valentina's. When the police show up, the first thing they do is they go to Valentina's apartment, and they're surprised to find Tamara living there. And they're kind of sensitive with her, and they say, "Your friend, your relative, was just found deceased and we need to look around the apartment." Tamara was completely indifferent. She did not care. They had just discovered her body and she didn't care that they were searching the apartment. It was like she knew someday this was going to happen. During the search, the police officers quickly find blood all over the bathroom and in the kitchen. They even find the hacksaw she used that's got blood on it, and they find Tamara's diary that's sitting next to this book about black magic. And the police are horrified when they see that the diary contains meticulous notes that Tamara had kept of all of the ritualistic killings she had perpetrated over the past 20 years. And there was 14 of them. And almost all of them were motivated by Tamara's desire to cast spells that she apparently was reading about in these black magic books she had. And virtually all of these spells required human flesh or other human components. And so she would kill these people, she would use their bodies to cast these spells, and then afterwards she would consume them. Not because that had anything to do with the spell, but because she liked the way people tasted, in particular, human lungs. The police arrest Tamara, who doesn't put up a fight. She says, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." While Tamara was on trial, she seemed like she was in a great mood. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to reporters. It was like she was just totally out of touch. Or maybe she literally knew this was going to happen and just didn't care anymore. Tamara, who would be nicknamed the Granny Ripper by newspapers over the course of this trial, was given a life sentence, and to this day, she is still sitting in jail. Here is the surveillance footage of Tamara disposing of Valentina's body, as well as some shots of Tamara during her trial. After spending 21 years in the US Army, a man retires and moves to Central Florida with his wife and young son. Although his family had plenty of money because he had a pension coming in and his wife still worked full-time, he just got bored really quickly after moving to Central Florida and decided he would just take a job doing something just to stay occupied. And so he ended up taking a job at a highway gas station. One of the primary reasons he chose this particular job is because the owners of the gas station didn't care if his son came along to help him stock shelves and hang out behind the cash register. And so for years, that's just how it went. The man would work at the gas station and his son would tag along. Even after his son became a teenager and you'd think might be wanting to do other things, well, the town was so small, there was almost nothing to do. So his son still came along well into his teenage years. One night in 1990, his son, who was 15 years old at the time, was at the station and he was actually taking a break sitting outside on a picnic table. He was reading a magazine, drinking a Mountain Dew, and it's dark out, and he notices out of the corner of his eye that there is a woman walking off of the highway towards the gas station. It was a very quiet night at the time, so there's no cars getting gas, there's nobody there, and there's not really anybody even driving on the highway, and so that's why she really stood out to him. And he turns and he notices her and he thinks to himself, no one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here. So she must have broken down and she must be coming here to try to use our phone to call a tow truck or something like that. So the woman is walking across the lot, coming closer and closer to the gas station, and the boy at this point has turned his attention back to his magazine, but he would say later that he kept looking up and keeping an eye on her because there was something off about her. The woman ultimately walks right behind him and goes in the door into the gas station. Doesn't acknowledge the boy, doesn't say hi to him, just walks straight inside, and she starts walking up and down the aisles of the gas station. Now, from where the boy was sitting, it's all glass, so he could clearly look in and see his father behind the counter, and he could see the head of this woman as she walked in and around all these aisles. And as soon as the woman was in the store, kind of pacing around the aisles, the boy put his magazine down and was just watching. And he noticed that she was not really shopping. She was just looking down for a few seconds, wouldn't pick anything up, so she wasn't buying anything. And she would look up at the counter where his father was, and she would just stare at him. And then she'd look back down at what she was doing and she would go through all the aisles. And at some point, the woman just kind of abandons this phony, I'm pretending to shop routine and just walks up to the counter. Now, nobody else is in the store. There's nobody else coming in. And so the boy could actually fairly clearly hear what she was saying to his father. And she told his father that she had broken down and she needed a ride and could he drive her to Ocala, which was the next big town north of this gas station. And the boy would say that his father acted very strangely because his father is normally incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He's very chatty even. Like he talks to everybody who comes in the store. But as soon as this woman had gone in, his dad had seemed kind of dismissive and almost rude to this woman, and when she was talking to him, asking for a ride, he just said, "No, I won't give you a ride." The woman is annoyed by how quickly she's been shot down, but instead of just taking no for an answer, she turns and looks at the boy who's sitting out on the bench, who's looking right at her, and she points at the boy, and she says, "What about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride?" The boy notices that his father, who's not within her eyesight, is looking at his son going, "No. Like, whatever she wants from you, you're gonna say no to it. And the boy's a little bit confused by this because he's still trying to understand why his dad was so against helping this woman, because she clearly needs our help or someone's help. But he just took his dad at face value, and when the woman's pointing at him, he knew, the boy, that if she came over and asked him, he would say no. But it wouldn't come to that, because the boy's father would say to the woman, no, my son's not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you. She's furious. She's cussing him out. She storms out and slams the door. She starts cussing at the boy, and she walks off. The whole time she's turning around and flipping them off and screaming profanities at them, but she ultimately walks off. And the dad kind of followed her out and is standing next to his son as she walks off. And the boy asks his dad, like, what was her deal? Why did that happen? Why did you not want to help her? And the dad just said, I don't know. There was something off about her, and I don't know how to place it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I knew she had to go. A year later, the boy is in his room when he hears his dad in the other room yelling for him to come in here and look at the TV. So he runs into the TV room, and on the TV is the same woman from the gas station, better known as Eileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who used to pick up her male victims at gas stations in Florida. It's unclear whether the boy or the boy's father were her next victims. But by the time she had shown up at that gas station, she had already killed 4 people. And following that interaction with them at the gas station, she had gone on to kill 3 more people, including someone in Ocala, Florida, which was the town she had asked them to give her a ride to. Eileen had been caught, that's why she was on TV, and she was later sentenced to death.
Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you gotta act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all expenses paid for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's gonna be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mrballen. That is fandiem.com/Mrballen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show.
In the early evening of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zivana Temolkoska walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kisevo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Zivana cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Zivana had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around making herself something to eat, and at some point as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring. And so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Zivana if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Zivana was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town. And unfortunately, Zivana's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Zivana let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Zivana Zavana, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Zavana just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Zavana did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Zavana disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Zavana's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here. And then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or, what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Zavana was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing. On this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Zavana lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Zavana had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Zavana was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Zavana's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Zavana appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Zavana murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Zavana's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house and they explained how, they had seen Zvana running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Zvana, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Zvana. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Zvana was found murdered, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A serial killer stalks Kosovo." In the story, Vlado says that Zvana's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zvana, literally. They were poor older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims and he put it all together. The other 2 victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubica Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the 05 and 07 murders of those 2 other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all 3 murders and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Zvana had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people. And they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene, ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, the police had surrounded this very modest two-story home that was very overgrown out front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police and whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go. And then the door slowly opened up. And this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch. And the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. And when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside, he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother. i.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His three victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zvana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zvana get into a car with two men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zvana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zvana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zvana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all three of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer. And eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell, while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed.
On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at the border between New York State and Ontario, Canada. And as he looked out at the dozens of cars lined up at his checkpoint,
he felt an enormous amount of responsibility. Because for him, working at border security was not just about checking people's passports. It was also about making sure dangerous criminals from the United States did not flee their country and enter Canada. And today, there was one particular dangerous criminal from the United States that this guard was on high alert for. A 30-year-old man named Alex Mangle. A few days earlier, Alex Mangle had been stopped by a police officer near New York City. And during this traffic stop, Alex had somehow taken the police officer's gun and shot the officer in the head, killing them, and then Alex had fled and he was still on the run. And so now law enforcement was concerned that because New York was only 6 hours from the Canadian border, that it was very possible that Alex might try to flee into Canada to escape persecution. And so US and Canadian law enforcement and border security were on the lookout for Alex Mangle. And he was this 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And so all day long, that Canadian border security guard looked very closely at every person who came through his checkpoint to see if they were Alex Mangle. He would see a family on their way to visit relatives in Canada. He would see a couple on their honeymoon. He would see a man with a car full of camping supplies and a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and all these different people from all walks of life, but none of them looked anything like Alex Mangle. And so by the end of his shift, after checking dozens and dozens of cars and looking at every person, he felt certain that Alex Mangle had not slipped through his checkpoint. And so he clocked out and he went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was patrolling this parking lot right outside of a shopping mall in Ontario, Canada, which was located about an hour and a half away from the border. And during his patrol, at some point, he noticed there was this one car, a white Toyota, that had been loitering in the area for quite a while. And so he decided to drive over and see what was going on. And when he got there, he looked inside the vehicle and he saw someone sitting on the passenger seat. And he was a white man, probably in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And this officer immediately recognized this guy as being the wanted criminal, Alex Mangle. And so the officer immediately called for backup, and then he parked his car, got out, and approached the white Toyota where this guy was sitting with his gun drawn. And as the officer approached the passenger side door, the man inside turned, noticed the officer, jumped into the driver's seat, fired up the car, and the Toyota sped out of the parking lot. And so the officer, he jumps back in his cruiser and he takes off after him. And before long, it was like the entirety of the police force in Toronto was a part of this high-speed chase to catch this guy. And eventually they funneled the car into a dead-end street, and the white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and then the man inside with the mustache and the thinning brown hair pops out, and immediately everybody sees, yep, that's Alex Mangle. He didn't put up a fight at that point. He was taken into custody. However, despite how relieved law enforcement was to have this cop killer in custody, they realized they didn't understand something. How was it that Alex Mangle got past border security and got into Canada? Everybody was on high alert looking for him. What happened? And so police were baffled until they searched that white Toyota Alex had been driving. On the night that Alex shot and killed that police officer near New York City, he immediately fled to this wooded area and hid out overnight. And then the next day when he got up, he was walking around and he happened to pass by this commercial building. And as he was looking at it, he saw this middle-aged woman, whose name was Beverly Capone, come out of the building and make her way towards her car. And she was all alone. And so Alex walked up to her and abducted her at gunpoint, and then he drove her to this cabin out in the woods that he knew would be totally isolated, no one was there. And once they got there, he murdered her, and then once she was dead, he stole her clothes and put it on, and also cut off her face and her scalp and put those on as well. He was literally wearing her skin and hair. And he hopped in that white Toyota and he drove up to the Canadian border, and amazingly, he got through the checkpoint into Canada without anybody noticing. It would turn out that Canadian border security guard, who all day was checking for Alex Mangle, did actually see Alex Mangle. He just didn't recognize him because Alex Mangle was wearing Beverly Capone's face, hair, and clothes. And so he thought he was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he let him on through. And so police would figure this whole thing out when they searched that white Toyota, because they would find lying on the floorboard was Beverly's dress, scalp, and face. Alex was deported back to the US. However, before he could stand trial, he attempted to escape a prison transport and in the process got shot to death by police. However, that was not the end of Alex's story. Following his death, officers continued to investigate him and also his property,
And at some point during a search of his property, they would discover all these photos of unidentified women, along with these maps where these very isolated places in New York and Pennsylvania were circled, and nobody knows what they mean. Now, police have not conclusively linked Alex to any other murders, but he does remain a suspect in several cases, and in fact, many investigators believe Alex was actually a serial killer. However, we'll probably never know how many people Alex actually killed because he took all of his secrets to the grave.
On the morning of February 2nd, 2012, a young man pulled off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, into a large, snowy parking lot. He passed by dozens of parked cars until he arrived in front of this small shack that was brightly teal-colored. It was a popular coffee shop called the Common Grounds, and this young man worked as a barista there. After he parked his car, he walked up to the white door employee entrance to this little building, and he got his key out and he went to unlock the door, but when he turned the key, he saw the door was already unlocked. He knew the girl who had worked the previous night and would have been responsible for locking the shop up. She was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, and although she had only been on the job for about a month, she seemed very responsible and had never had any issues closing up before. The young man shrugged it off though. He figured people make mistakes, and he went inside. Right away, he noticed that a couple of things just seemed out of place. It was like Samantha must have just left in the middle of her shift without even attempting to clean up. There were napkins on the ground, there were towels out, there were cups still out. And so as this young man is walking over to the cash register to unlock it, he's running through scenarios in his head about how Samantha could have been so sloppy. And then he reached down with his register key, and just like the door, the cash register was already unlocked. When he pulled the tray out, all the money was gone. And that's when he knew they had been robbed. And so he called his boss. The night before, Samantha had asked her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift at the Common Grounds. Dwayne arrived in front of the kiosk at about 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift should have been over. Dwayne had gotten held up at his job, which is why he was late. And so when he gets there, Dwayne looks around the parking lot and he doesn't see Samantha anywhere. He sees the coffee shop itself is totally dark and looks like it's been closed up for the night. And so Dwayne gets out of his truck into the freezing cold night air, and he walked up to the window of this coffee shop and he pressed his face up to the glass to look inside, but there was nobody in there. Dwayne automatically went back to the fight he had gotten into with Samantha earlier in the night via text message. She had accused him of cheating on her. He had been kind of nonchalant, like he didn't care about it, and what ensued was a really ugly fight. And so as Dwayne is walking back to his truck, he's thinking to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight, and so at the end of her shift, she got a ride home from her father or maybe from a friend, and that's why she's not here. And so Dwayne gets back inside of his truck and he sends a text message to Samantha asking if she's okay, if she's gotten home, but after several minutes of no response from her, Dwayne, even though they were fighting, he still cares an awful lot about his girlfriend. He decides, I gotta go by her house and make sure she's there and that she's okay. And so a couple minutes later, he gets to her house, he goes up to the door, and her single father, James, answers the door. Dwayne explains that he didn't see Samantha after her shift and just wanted to make sure she was here, but James says, she's not here. I have no idea where she is. I haven't spoken to her. And so the two men go into James's kitchen, they sit down, and they start texting and calling Samantha to try to figure out where she is. And after a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lights up, and it's a text message from Samantha. And the message clearly indicates that she's still very upset with Dwayne, but she's saying that she needs some time to think and that she's going to be with some friends for a couple of days, and would he, Dwayne, let her father know where she was. And so Dwayne shows James the text message, and Samantha's father looks at it and he's thinking to himself, this is very uncharacteristic of Samantha. He had raised Samantha since she was 2 years old, and they were very close. They shared everything with each other. It didn't make any sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say that she was going to be out with friends for a couple of days. And it didn't make sense that she would ignore all of his phone calls and text messages when clearly he was worried about her. The two men stayed up super late, calling and texting, hoping to get more information from Samantha, but she never responded. She never texted back. And so the following morning, when neither men had gotten gotten any more messages from Samantha, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report for his only daughter. After receiving this missing person report, an officer with the Anchorage Police Department called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. And the owner actually said they just got a call from their barista that was working at the kiosk that morning, and they had informed them that apparently there had been a robbery and no one can get in touch with Samantha. No one knows where she is. The owner told the police officer that as soon as she got her hands on the security footage from the night before, she would send it over to the police department. While the police waited for this footage, some officers began calling Samantha's friends and other family members to see if they knew where she was, but no one had heard from her and no one knew where she was. No one had any information. Some other police officers headed over to the Common Grounds coffee kiosk to get a look at it for themselves. And when they got there was no sign of a struggle outside or inside the kiosk, and inside, underneath the counter, was a panic button that had not been pressed. And so even though Samantha's father thought there was something odd about her final text message, the police began operating under the theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk and then left of her own accord. But what confounded police was how Samantha actually physically got away from the coffee shop. She didn't have a car that night, and she couldn't have just walked away because the weather was way too miserable and cold outside, and Anchorage is just not really a walkable city. And so if Samantha was telling the truth, that she was just taking a couple of days to be by herself with some friends at their place, then why didn't any of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop made the security footage available. The footage, which has no audio, picks up around 8 p.m. on February 1st, 2012, which was the night Samantha went missing. It shows Samantha inside of the kiosk. She's working alone, she's cheerful, and she's busy. And then at some point, someone that we can't see, they're outside of the camera's range, comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha clearly turns to them, acknowledges their drink order, and turns and begins making this drink. And then after she's done making it, she turns to give it to this person, and immediately Samantha steps back and puts her arms up. And then seconds later, she reaches over and turns off the lights inside of the kiosk, and then she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, not talking, not moving, for about a minute before she slowly stands up and walks down the kiosk towards the cash register. She opens it up, she scoops some money out of it, then she walks back to the window and appears to hand it to a shadowy figure on the other side of the window, and then Samantha turns, kneels again with her back to the window. 2 more minutes go by before this person outside the window leans their entire upper body inside of the coffee shop. They reach down and they appear to tie Samantha's hands. Now, because it was dark inside of the kiosk, the footage winds up being extremely grainy, and there's no way to identify who this figure is. Although it's fairly obvious that it's a male. He's wearing a big sweatshirt and he's got a hat pulled down low over his face. After this mystery man is done tying Samantha's hands, he leaps through the window and then shuts the window behind him. And then he stands Samantha up, he puts a gun into her back, and then he marches her out the employee door and then out across the lot, all the way to a white pickup truck where he puts her inside and they drive off. Over the next couple of days, the police and also the FBI, who had been called in to be a part of this investigation, they just kept hitting dead end after dead end because there was no evidence. All they had was this surveillance footage that was too grainy to tell who this guy was that took Samantha. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, had rallied the support of nearly all 300,000 people that lived in Anchorage to go out and look for his daughter. His efforts were so profound, it had attracted major news outlets across the country, and suddenly his daughter's story had grabbed national headlines everywhere. This led to strangers donating thousands of dollars to fund a reward for anybody that had information about Samantha's whereabouts. But despite this reward growing in size every single day, and the national news media becoming increasingly more interested in this case, no one came forward with useful information that led to developments in this case, and Samantha never got in touch with Dwayne or her father. Then on February 24th, so 3 weeks after Samantha's gone missing and no one's heard from her, Dwayne got a text message from Samantha's phone, and it was directing him to a particular sign inside of a nearby public park. And so Dwayne and James read this text, they shared it with the police department, and then they raced to this park and actually beat the police there by about 15 minutes. And so Dwayne and James, they walked through the gates, and they start walking down this main trail, and they stop in front of this sign. It was actually a bulletin board, and tacked on the bulletin board was a Ziploc bag, inside of which was a typed ransom note, and on the ransom note, literally Xeroxed onto it, was a black and white photo of Samantha. And in this photo, Samantha looks kind of dazed, like she's got a blank expression, and she's not really looking at the camera, she's looking just to the side of the camera. And then in this picture, a man is holding a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper that's dated February 13th, 2012. This was a proof of life photo where Samantha's captor was holding up that newspaper to indicate that Samantha was alive as of February 13th. And so to everybody involved in this case, including Samantha's father, even though this is still not a good situation at all, it was kind of a relief to know that at least as of last week, Samantha was alive. As for the demands of this ransom note, James was told to deposit $30,000 into his daughter's account immediately, and if he did that, she would be released 6 months later. As advised by the FBI, James deposited a portion of the ransom money into his daughter's account, and then the FBI just waited and watched, because they knew if anyone tried to withdraw money from that account, they could track where the card was. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made within Anchorage, but each time the FBI got a notification about one of these withdrawals, they would rush to the scene, and whoever it was that had tried to make this withdrawal was long gone. When they pulled the security footage from these 3 different ATMs, the person that was making these withdrawals was a man wearing a ski mask and big sunglasses, so they had no way to identify him. After these withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week, and in that time, there was no word from Samantha. Then on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but they were in Arizona, and then New Mexico, and then in Texas. Again, authorities would rush to these ATMs, but they would get there right after the masked man with sunglasses had just left. But there was a break this time. In one of these surveillance videos from one of the Texas ATMs, they spotted the car this guy was getting into before he left. And it was a small sedan, it was a white Ford Focus, and they saw him leave going east on a Texas highway. And so authorities in Texas were told to look out for this particular car in this part of Texas. And sure enough, on March 13th, a Texas patrolman spotted the car sitting in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby until a man in his 30s walked out of one of the hotel rooms, walked down and got inside the car, and then this patrolman just kind of followed him and looked for any reason to pull him over. And as he had his radar gun on this guy, he noticed he was going 2 miles per hour above the speed limit, and so he pulled him over. The patrolman got out, he walked up to the driver's side window, the window was already down, the man was very calm. The patrolman asked him for his license, and the guy handed him an Alaskan license. His name was Israel Keys, he was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The patrolman knew this was the guy. He called in backup, and before long they were searching Keys' car, and in the trunk they found a ski mask along with other clothes that matched the description of the guy who was making withdrawals from these different ATMs. They also found a gun, as well as Samantha's cell phone and debit card. After Keys was arrested and was brought into custody, he denied having any involvement with Samantha's disappearance. But after being presented with the overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise, he caved and said yes, he would tell them the full story of what happened to Samantha, but they had to get him an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers, and a cigar. Once he had said items, he began to speak. And what he said was so disturbing and so graphic, the FBI still has not released the full transcript of his confession. Here is the version of events based on what was made public. On February 1st, 2012, Keys decided he was going to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting there to be some teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He asked her for an Americano, and while she turned to make his drink, suddenly his plan changed. Not only was he going to steal money from inside of this coffee shop, he decided he was going to steal Samantha from this coffee shop. When she turned back with his drink and handed it to him, he discreetly pulled his gun out and aimed it at her and told her this was a robbery. That's when she backed up and put her hands up, and then she turned around, he tied her hands, he jumped back inside, and then he said after he shut the window, he jammed napkins inside of her mouth so she couldn't make any sound, and then he marched her out the door, outside, into his car, and they took off. Once they were in the vehicle, he pulled the napkins out of her mouth mouth, and he told her if she tried to escape or if she tried to flag anybody down that he would just kill her. And so he said she was very obedient. She was obviously very scared, but she was trying to do her best to stay composed. At some point, Keyes reached over and took her phone and sent that text message to her boyfriend informing him that she was going to be spending a couple of days with friends and that he should tell her father. And then Keyes told Samantha he was going to be holding her hostage and trying to extract some ransom money. Samantha told Keyes that her family was very poor and that he wouldn't get much money out of them. To which Keyes said, "Don't worry about it. I know they'll raise money and they'll come up with it somehow." Then they drove around Anchorage for several hours, periodically stopping so Samantha could get out and relieve herself, other times so Keyes could smoke a cigar. Then around midnight, Keyes made his way back to his house and he pulled into the driveway and he turned to Samantha and he had her go in the back seat and lie down and he put some tarps over her and he told her if she tried to escape, he would kill her. And then Keyes got out and he walked inside of his house where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. And in just a few hours, Keyes and his daughter were scheduled to go to New Orleans for a 2-week-long luxury cruise. Keyes left his house and went back to his car. He put a blindfold on Samantha and then led her down the driveway to his shed. Once inside, he sat her down on an upturned bucket in the back of the shed, and then he put a rope around her neck and he anchored each end of the rope to the wall so she was pinned to the wall. Then Keyes turned his radio all the way up to make sure it masked any noise she might make, even though he reminded her repeatedly that if she made any noise, he would just kill her, and by and large, she was very obedient. And then he gave her a couple of cigarettes to smoke and told her it was going to be just fine, to just chill out, that he was going to get the ransom money from their family, and then as soon as that was done, he would let her go. He turned on some space heaters to keep the space warm, and then he left and locked the door. He walked back into his house and double-checked that his daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. They were. Afterwards, he started drinking some wine and relaxing, and then after a little while, he got a cup of water and he went back out to the shed. He went inside and he gave the water to Samantha, and he said Samantha was very composed. She was obviously frightened, but she asked him, "Did you speak to my father? Did you figure out the ransom situation?" And Keyes told her that, "Yes, I talked to your father. Everything's working out fine. He's going to raise the money. We're going to get you out of here. Everything's going exactly to plan." After that, he walked up to Samantha and he unscrewed the 2 anchors that were holding that rope up against her throat, and then he cut the zip ties on her wrist, allowing her to relax and sit forward and just kind of be at ease for a second. And it was very obvious that Samantha was relieved. Her nightmare was about to be over. But then seconds later, Keyes grabbed her really aggressively and tied her up all over again, this time much more thoroughly and much more tightly. It had been a cruel trick. When he cut her handcuffs and undid her necktie, he just wanted to see what she would do if she thought she was being let go. When in reality, he was never going to let her go. There was no ransom. He had not spoken to her father. It was all a big lie. Keyes told investigators that as he was tying her up for that second time, he looked at her face and she had this look of total resignation. He said she knew what was about to happen to her. After Keyes tied her up, he left the shed and locked it behind him. He went inside to check one more time to make sure his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. When they were, he went back to the shed, he opened it up, he went inside, and this time when he stepped inside, it smelled like urine and sweat, and he looked down at Samantha and she was terrified. He walked up to her and he began to assault her, and then after he was done, he was standing over her getting his clothes back on, and Samantha very stoically looks up at him and says, "Are you going to kill me?" And he says, "Yes, I am." As he put on his leather gloves, she tried to talk him out of it, but he said there was no other way. Keyes would tell investigators that he was very impressed with Samantha's bravery. Shortly before 4 a.m., Keyes drove a knife into Samantha's back before choking her until she stopped moving. He told investigators that she never made a sound. After she was dead, Keyes left the shed and locked it behind him. He went into his house, he took a shower. Afterwards, he woke up his daughter and told her to start getting ready because they were leaving soon for the airport. While his daughter was getting ready, Keyes went back out to the shed. He went inside, he rolled Samantha's body up in a tarp and pushed her towards the back. He unplugged the space heaters, turned off the lights, turned off the music, and then double locked the shed and went back inside the house to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a cab showed up at the house and Keyes and his daughter hopped inside and they made their way to the airport and then on to New Orleans, where they went on their 2-week-long vacation. After they got back, Keyes went inside of his shed, he unrolled Samantha from her tarp, and by his account, she still looked fairly lively, and so he dressed her in some new clothes, he put lots of makeup on her face, he braided her hair, and then he stitched her eyelids open so it gave the impression she was alive and alert, and then he held up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News next to her, and then took several photos, creating that proof of life photo for the ransom note. If you want to see this photo, you can Google it, but that's up to you. After he took these pictures, he chopped her body up into pieces and then disposed of her in a nearby frozen lake. It would turn out Samantha was not Israel Keys' first victim. He was in fact a serial killer who specifically preyed on completely random people because he enjoyed watching them die. Over the years, he had hid what he called kill kits all over the United States, which were these caches filled with weapons and other tools designed to capture and kill people. This way, no matter where he was in the country, when he had an urge to go kill someone, he would just go to his nearest kill kit, dig it up, and then go target a random stranger. And he didn't care if you were young, old, big, small, male, female, alone, or in a group. Everyone was a target of opportunity. Keys told investigators that as soon as he saw Samantha inside of that coffee kiosk, instantly he knew he was going to kill her. Everything about the ransom, the robbery, all of it was just a lie to keep her in line, to give her some hope that she might get out of this alive, when in reality, the second she walked outside of the doors of that kiosk, she was dead. Keys admitted to killing Samantha as well as an older couple up in Vermont, but he would take his own life in a jail cell in December of 2012 before he named any of his other victims. And so to this day, we have no idea how many people he killed. The best guess is 11 based on a drawing he made in his jail cell, but that's just a guess.
In the early morning hours of Saturday, March 29th, 1997, a blonde 26-year-old waitress named Kim Mrballen carried a tray of filet mignon through a topless bar in Charlotte, North Carolina, while wearing a leotard and tights. She made her way through the cigar smoke-filled room, past the stage where all the half-naked women were busy pole dancing. Kim worked here at the men's club 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she liked the job. It paid well, and by working the night shift, it left her days free, so she could focus on her 2 real passions, which were taking care of her horses and decorating her brand new house. So Kim and her husband Bridger had recently bought a 7-acre plot of land outside the nearby town of Monroe, where Bridger had actually grown up. They'd spent the past year building their dream home, including a barn for their 3 horses, and now that the construction was done, they had finally started moving in and decorating. Now, as Kim delivered the filet mignons to a table of middle-aged businessmen, she glanced over at the clock on the wall, and she felt a surge of excitement when she saw that there was less than an hour left in her shift. Kim had the next 3 days off, and she planned to use all that free time to finish some of the smaller moving projects that still needed to get done, like just unpacking boxes and hanging some pictures. So she flashed the businessmen a smile and then went to check on her other tables. An hour later, a little after 2 a.m., Kim walked out the back entrance of the bar, now wearing a baggy sweatshirt instead of her work uniform, and she called out a goodbye over her shoulder to some coworkers, and then walked over to where her red Jeep was parked along the side of the building. She got in, dropped her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, turned on the car, and then turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. A half an hour later, Kim drove south down Old Charlotte Highway, a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much deserted at this hour. She used to find this commute kind of relaxing, but lately, it had been making her nervous to be driving alone late at night. And the reason for that was because a couple of weeks ago, while she was driving home from work around this same time of night, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another vehicle had come up from behind and started tailgating her and honking their horn at her repeatedly for really no apparent reason. Kim had been afraid that this was a customer from the men's club who was now following her home, and it freaked her out so much that she'd actually pulled over into a convenience store parking lot because she saw there was a police car parked in there as well, and so she'd gone right over to the officer to ask for help. He'd promised to go and try and track down this road rager, and he'd even sent out a broadcast over the police radio, telling all the other officers to keep an eye out for Kim's car on the night she was working in case anyone gave her more trouble. And so now, even though, that road rager had never been caught, Kim did feel better knowing that the police had her back. But again, because the road rager had not been caught, she was still a bit scared about driving home alone. So tonight, to calm her nerves, she fished out her cell phone out of her purse and just called her husband, Bridger. When he answered, he told her that he was actually on the road too. He was still driving back from a gig DJing at a prom in a town 2 hours away, but he was almost home. After chatting for a few minutes, Bridger told Kim that he was actually pulling into their driveway and that he would call her right back once he got inside the house. So Kim said fine and said goodbye, and they hung up, and she kept on driving.
Then, about 15 minutes later, so a little before 3 a.m., her phone rang. And it was Bridger again, calling back like he had promised he would. And he asked Kim if she was close, and she told him that she was just passing by Union Station Restaurant, which meant she was maybe about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was pretty tired and he was getting ready for bed, and in case he was asleep by the time she got in, he wished her goodnight. And Kim said goodnight back, and then she hung up, and she put her phone down on the passenger seat. But just as Kim turned her attention back towards the road, a sudden bright light almost blinded her. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights right behind her. About an hour later, Kim's husband Bridger sat up in bed and looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It was 3:59 a.m., an hour after having spoken to Kim. I mean, she should have been home 20 minutes after that phone call, and she still wasn't back. So he got out of bed and he checked every room in their two-story house, but Kim wasn't in any of them. There was no sign of her. Then Bridger looked out the window and he saw her Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. So at this point, he hurried into the kitchen and he picked up the phone and he dialed Kim's cell phone number. And it rang a few times, and then a strange male voice answered. Bridger asked who he was speaking to, and the man told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger asked him, okay, well, where's my wife? And the officer told him that he didn't know. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the road and found this phone inside of it, and it was ringing, and so he answered it. But he said, there's nobody here. Several minutes later, so this is a little bit after 4 a.m. on March 29, 1997, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, a police investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, drove north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove his patrol car past parking lots and houses until he reached the very edge of town. And finally, he saw what he was looking for: a red Jeep parked along the opposite side of the road, with another patrol car parked right behind it. He pulled a U-turn and parked on the shoulder, and as he got out of his car, he recognized Captain David Simpson standing there, waiting for him. Simpson told Chief Hulk that he had just found this Jeep idling on the side of the road about 15 minutes ago with its headlights on, and he had walked up. There had been nobody inside of it, but when he looked in, there was a cell phone, and it began to ring. And so, acting on instinct, he answered the phone, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin who was calling saying, I'm looking for my wife. This is her phone. She hasn't come home. And Captain Simpson also said that he actually recognized this Jeep from a random run-in he had had 2 weeks earlier outside of a convenience store with Kim Medlin. And so he put it together and he's like, okay, Bridger's calling. This is definitely Kim's car, but Kim's nowhere to be found. And Hulk actually recognized Kim's name because he actually happened to be friends with Kim's husband, Bridger. And so he pulled out his flashlight and he began looking inside the Jeep, and right away, he saw there was a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. And when he looked inside the wallet, there were credit cards, there was cash, but there was like this clear section of the wallet where obviously you would slide your driver's license, and there was nothing there. So it very much looked like her license had been pulled out on purpose. Now, their initial theory was, okay, well, maybe Kim got pulled over by a police officer and took out her license to hand to the cop. But in a department as small as Monroe's, there were only a few officers on duty at this time of night. And when Assistant Chief Hulk asked Captain Simpson, had any of the on-duty officers pulled anybody over that night, Simpson was already all over it. He had checked. And he said, no, none of our officers pulled anybody over. So this made Hulk wonder if maybe Kim had been pulled over by somebody posing as a cop. There had actually been dozens of reports over the years of so-called blue light bandits pretending to be police officers in order to harass drivers, especially young women. But those cases were really quite rare, even though they did happen. So Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions quite yet. Just then, Hulk heard a truck engine and saw headlights approaching up the highway. So he set the wallet back down on the seat and then walked over to where a black pickup truck was now pulling to a stop right behind Hulk's car. A tall man with blonde hair got out of the driver's seat, and right away Hulk knew who it was. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. And Bridger looked frantic, and he demanded to know what had happened to his wife. But Hulk told him to calm down, that they were here to try to figure out what happened to his wife and where she went. Hulk went on to say that, look, we showed up and we just found her car here. But there were no broken windows or slashed tires or any sign of a struggle, so it was possible that maybe Kim just ran into car trouble and maybe she went out to go find help. But then, without asking for permission, Bridger pushed past Hulk and just climbed right inside of the Jeep's driver's seat and said, well, let's test your theory right now and see whether the car was working. Hulk told him to get out of the Jeep, but Bridger just totally ignored him, and then he put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse and he drove it backward, ultimately parking it in its original place, showing that it worked just fine. And even though at this point Hulk was kind of annoyed with Bridger for what he had just done, he couldn't help but think, this is bad, something's going on here. And so Hulk walked over to his car and he radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. And he asked them to bring a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she left on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars pulled up to the scene, and a few officers and a police dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog went in and sniffed around, getting familiar with the scent of Kim's belongings. Then the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground, and so the officers told Bridger, who clearly wanted to go with them, to stay put, stay with your truck, and then they followed the dog down the road for about 100 yards or so until it turned onto a driveway. Hulk and the others followed the dog up this long driveway towards a small house nestled in the trees right off the highway, and the dog sniffed all the way up to the garage and then stopped. That was where Kim's trail ended. And so Hulk went up to the house and rang the doorbell, and a minute later, a man answered. And despite the late hour, he looked totally awake and not particularly surprised to see cops at his door. Hulk asked the man who he was and whether or not he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours near his property. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett, and about an hour ago, so maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he noticed that it had Texas plates, and that there also had been a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan told them to go right ahead. And so Hulk directed the other officers to search the inside of the house, while he clicked on his flashlight and headed over to the garage. When he got there, he turned the handle of a door on the side of the garage, and he found it was unlocked. So he pushed the door open, and he shined his flashlight inside, but all he saw was a truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time dawn broke around 6 a.m. that morning, this had become officially a missing persons case. So police began a search of the woods around the Old Charlotte Highway with help from members of the community. Meanwhile, Hulk and Simpson went back to the station to speak to one of the dispatchers who had been on duty that night. After speaking to that homeowner, Nathan, and searching his house and his garage, he had been ruled out as a suspect. So now they were focused on finding that car with the Texas plates that Nathan had seen loitering outside of his garage. So they were hoping that maybe there was a report of a traffic stop or maybe a suspicious car in the area or anything that might help figure out who was driving that car. But the dispatcher said again that really there had been no stops, nothing that night. However, there had been one incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., so it was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They'd gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was found. Hulk asked who had responded to that call, and the dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately gave Officer Griffin a phone call and asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out responding to that car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He actually said that his shift was over around the time that driver had flagged him down for help, so he had actually just called for a tow truck, and when it got there, maybe a little bit after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he just went home. Hulk hung up the phone feeling pretty disappointed. Bridger said the last time he heard from his wife Kim was around 3 a.m., so if this car was already being towed away by 2:30 a.m., then it definitely was not the same car that Nathan saw loitering outside of his garage, and the driver of that car in the ditch was likely not a suspect. Hulk sighed in frustration, but then another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to elaborate on that random run-in he had had with Kim a couple of weeks earlier. Now, this was sort of a long shot to bring it up again, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from the road rage incident could have maybe come back and, maybe chased Kim off the road or something. Simpson said he would go dig up the report that he had filed on the incident, and then he left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the road rage police report. It said that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, so exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer named Roger Griffin. So Officer Josh Griffin is the one who responded to the car stuck in the ditch. Officer Roger Griffin is actually Josh's father, and he was with Captain Simpson that night. So the report said that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually caught up with the car that was harassing Kim a little bit further down the road. There were two men inside the car, Eric Williams and George Connell, and they claimed that they thought Kim was actually the one harassing them by flashing her lights at them. And so to Simpson and to Griffin, it had seemed like a big misunderstanding, so the officers had just let them go. But Hulk, now looking at this through a very different lens, felt like he needed to speak to Eric and George regardless. And so in the report, he found the contact information for Eric and George, and he called them both up. But it turned out they both had airtight alibis for the night of Kim's disappearance. But even still, it struck Hulk as very odd that Kim had gone missing from her car on the same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. And he had a hard time believing it was all just, one big coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk drove down Westwood Industrial Drive, a deserted dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep was found. And as he was driving, he saw at the end of the street there were a couple of police cars parked there. And so he pulled his own car behind them, and he got out. He walked into the trees where he could see the beams of several flashlights moving around in the darkness. And as he got closer, he saw officers putting up police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a pile of roofing shingles and branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from two men who were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they said to police that they had found a body in the woods in this spot, but they hadn't touched it. And so now with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team removed the shingles and branches that were covering the body, and Hulk pulled out his flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. And he saw right away it was a deceased woman, and it was definitely Kim Mrballen. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten, and there were also cuts and bruises all over her neck, and there were some scrapes on her knees. And her necklace and wedding ring were still on, so her killer had not robbed her. Hulk stood back as the forensics team untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could collect clippings of her fingernails, in case she had maybe scratched off a trace of her killer's DNA. And as Hulk watched one of these forensics officers go to put the sweatshirt inside of an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and he shined his flashlight on the sweatshirt's fabric, and it revealed a shoe print. And so he told the officers to send that sweatshirt to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and type of shoe that had left that print. But while he would have to wait for those results, he knew he had a couple of other big clues to help narrow down a suspect. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known as Lover's Lane, so basically a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. And the fact that Kim's killer had thought to take her there meant they were probably a local and familiar with the area. Now, it was still theoretically possible that she'd just been run off the road by some stranger for some reason, or, maybe a customer had followed her home from work, or maybe it was a blue light bandit impersonating a police officer. But the second big clue was that there was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. And because of that, Hulk did not think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room with his friend and first murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger had been really pushy and really in some ways over-involved in the investigation from literally the moment Kim's Jeep was found. He'd messed with the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission, and now Hulk had information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. So when Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, he called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then he immediately went to bed. But now, a police officer had told Hulk that he had seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m.,
which was nowhere near Bridger's house, and nowhere near the route he would have taken to get back from his DJing gig. So once Hulk sat down, immediately he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. I mean, he's just learned that his wife was found dead, but Hulk had a job to do. And so he cut right to the chase. And he said to Bridger that, hey, this other officer said they saw your truck driving around in town. It contradicts your alibi. Why did you lie? And right away, Bridger exploded. He was so mad. And he shouted at Hulk that he couldn't believe at a time like this, you would accuse me of lying to you? You're insinuating that I hurt my wife? I didn't do this. He also yelled at Hulk for just wasting time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many clues pointing to a different story, like the lack of a struggle at the Jeep, and the rolled down window and missing driver's license, all of which made it look like a traffic stop gone wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anybody, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially after that road rage incident 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She never would have done that. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down security footage from around town on the night Kim was killed to see if there was proof that really Bridger was driving around when he said he was home. Because right now they had no evidence to show he was lying, and they actually just had to let Bridger go. But when Bridger was leaving, he'd been so angry and so defensive, it sort of made Hulk think that maybe Bridger did this. And in fact, the fact that Bridger had brought up that his wife would never have gotten out of the car in the middle of the night for a stranger, well, that only reinforced that she might have gotten out of the car for you, Bridger, because she knew and trusted you. But also, Hulk was thinking that another person or group of people that Kim might have gotten out of the car for would be police. Now, Hulk already knew that there were no police that pulled anybody over that night, but somebody could have pretended to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That was a theory that did sort of make sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep at certain times of the night because of that road rage incident. Now, police radios were not private, so anybody with a police scanner could have been listening in, and what they would have heard is, well, around this time of the night, this woman, Kim, often drives this road all by herself. And they basically could have just been waiting for her, knowing she was vulnerable. So Hulk picked up his phone and he began calling around to other police departments in the region. And he actually found out there had been 2 separate reports of blue light bandits harassing women recently. Now, one of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail when Kim was killed, so it could not have been him. But the other suspect still hadn't been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed down the phone in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the leads he'd had at the start of the investigation were now coming back as dead ends. When he tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance, there was no sign of her husband Bridger's truck driving through town until 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had been found by police. So the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck driving around at 2:30 did appear to have been mistaken, as Bridger said. Hulk also had reached out to Kim's manager and co-workers at the bar she worked at, thinking maybe her killer might have been a patron who followed her home. But none of them knew of any problems she had had with customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business that was near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night that Kim disappeared. And as he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he had seen her red Jeep go past. And right afterwards, he saw another car that was going in the other direction make a sort of sudden, sharp 3-point turn and speed right after the Jeep. The man had said that this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the rear, and he thought, or at least assumed, it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew that every single Monroe police officer that was on duty that night was accounted for, and they hadn't pulled anybody over at the time that Kim went missing. However, this new information certainly did support the theory that maybe Kim's killer was posing as a police officer, that they were a blue light bandit. So Hulk had spent the past couple of days trying to track down witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught, but he kept coming up dry. Nobody knew anything that could help track down that suspect. So it seemed like the investigation was really starting to slow down. But then Hulk's phone rang, and he answered it, and it was an expert from the forensics lab who had just finished analyzing that shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. And so Hulk leaned forward in nervous anticipation as the expert told him the results. And when he did, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Mrballen on March 29, 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They'd been prowling around for hours, pulling over young women for minor traffic infractions or sometimes for doing nothing wrong at all. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep coming down this road several nights a week, and they'd sort of grown obsessed with the young blonde woman who was driving it. And now they decided it was finally time to do something about that. So they pulled an abrupt three-point turn and raced after the Jeep and flipped on their car's flashing lights. Pretty soon, the Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder, and the killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside naturally rolled down the window, and she handed over her driver's license, which said her name was Kim Mrballen. And then she politely asked what the problem was, and the killer just told her to get out of the car. Now, Kim was visibly confused, but she did as she was told. And once she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists and then dragged her over to their car and tossed her in the back seat. Then the killer got in the driver's seat of their car as Kim began crying and insisting that she didn't do anything wrong. Why was she being arrested? But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing as they realized that even though they'd been dreaming about this moment for weeks, they actually didn't really have a plan for what they would do next. And so after a moment, they pulled over and just idled for a minute while they figured out what their next move was going to be. And then an idea came to them. They put their car in drive and continued down the highway. And as they turned onto a secluded dead-end road, Kim in the back seat suddenly got very quiet. And so the killer picked up on that and looked in the rearview mirror and saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And the killer suddenly realized that in all their excitement, they'd forgotten to lock the rear doors. The killer immediately tried to lock their doors with the power locks, but before they could, the rear door opened and Kim jumped out of the moving car. And so the killer came to a hard stop, they leapt out of the car and they ran back for Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands are still cuffed behind her, and without even thinking, the killer lifted up their flashlight and they smashed it into Kim's head, and then they stomped on her back and broke her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They reached down and they put their flashlight around Kim's neck, basically put it up against her throat, and then they pulled back on their arms, basically creating sort of a noose around her neck with this flashlight. And they held it like that, and they pulled as tight as they could until Kim stopped moving. After that, they dragged her body off the road and into the woods, where they removed her handcuffs and covered her body with branches and debris to hide it. Then the killer went home and cleaned up their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had actually left behind one crucial piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on the tread, which made it very easy to identify. And so weeks later, the forensics lab traced that print back to a shoe that was made by the Thorogood Company, a supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model happened to be the exact same shoe issued to officers in the Monroe Public Safety Department, which meant Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who had responded to a car in a ditch about a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would turn out Josh had learned the details about Kim's vehicle and late-night driving patterns from his father, Officer Roger Griffin,
after his father told him about that road rage incident that he and Captain Simpson had responded to on March 15th. And so Josh had basically been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since. Josh Griffin was arrested on May 30th, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the best we can offer is he became obsessed with Kim and attacked her. On an afternoon in June of 2005, a 57-year-old truck driver named Jack Reed took a sip of his margarita at a barbecue in a park in Derry, New Hampshire. Now, he usually didn't drink, but today he was celebrating. It was his daughter Megan's high school graduation party. And this was a big deal for Jack. He'd grown up in the foster care system with nothing, and he'd worked really hard to ensure that his kids were set up for a better life than he had. So he was just really proud of Megan for making the right choices and finishing school. Now he looked over and he saw Megan sitting at a picnic table with her brother, Jack Jr., and also their mother, Virginia. Even though he and Virginia were not together anymore, they were still on good terms, and he was glad the whole family could be there for this special occasion. But then Jack tensed up as he spotted somebody else who was walking across the grass toward them, Megan's boyfriend, Walter. So Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack was definitely not thrilled about it. He didn't have anything against Walter in particular, but his daughter was just 18 years old, and he thought that she was definitely too young to be living with a boyfriend. But Jack didn't want to pick a fight about it on a day like this. So instead, he actually got up and walked over to Walter and gave him a big friendly hug and said he was glad to see him. Then they both sat down at the table and joined the family's conversation, and as Jack took another sip of his margarita, he actually felt himself relax. That evening, after the party was over, Jack drove his car home and stopped at a gas station along the way. He parked at the pump, he went inside, and then passed the cashier a few bills for a tank of gas, and also a lottery ticket. Jack was a regular lottery player, and even though he'd never won anything particularly big, he was always hoping that one day he would hit the jackpot and strike it rich. So he put the ticket in his pocket and then went back outside and filled up his car. Then he got in his car and he drove a few more blocks to his home, which was a trailer parked behind a warehouse on the edge of town. And one big reason Jack chose to live here was because there was plenty of room to park all of his work vehicles, including a large red and black dump truck. After years of working as a truck driver, Jack had built his own trucking business from the ground up. He did garbage removal and moving and other odd jobs, and he was making a decent living. But he still lived frugally in his rented trailer so he could save up for retirement. His goal was to save enough so that in a couple of years, once Jack Jr. was done with school, he could leave the cold New Hampshire winters behind and move to sunny, beautiful Las Vegas. He'd gotten the idea a couple of years ago when he'd done a moving job for a local self-made millionaire who was moving from New Hampshire to Vegas. He saw the millionaire as a huge success story, and he believed that if he worked hard enough, or maybe got lucky enough, he could follow in this same path. Now, Jack got out of his car and he walked over to his trailer. He opened up the door and he went inside. He turned on the lights and he was just about to sit down to take off his shoes when he heard a noise outside. Immediately, he went to the window and pulled back the curtains and he looked outside into the woods behind the property, but he didn't see anything. Still, he felt his heart racing, and he actually had to take a few deep breaths to calm himself down. So almost 2 years ago, there'd been an incident where Jack heard someone creeping around outside his trailer. He'd grabbed his gun and went out to confront them, and he'd seen a man standing at the edge of the woods. The man had stared right at him and actually called out his name. Jack had actually fired his gun at this man, who then ran away into the woods and never came back. But Jack had never figured out what the encounter was about. As far as he knew, he didn't have any enemies, so it really just didn't make any sense. But again, since this strange guy was never caught, Jack was still very on edge whenever he heard strange noises outside and around his trailer. Now, as he looked out the window and he felt sure that there was nobody there, Jack closed the curtains and took the lottery ticket out of his pocket. He sat down at the table and he started scratching off the silver foil with a coin. And he was not a winner this time. But it didn't dampen his mood. Next time, he knew might be his lucky break. A couple of weeks later, on the morning of Monday, June 27th, Jack climbed up into his dump truck and rolled down the windows. It was already pretty hot outside, and he was on his way to the only job he had lined up for that day, a trash disposal gig that would likely only take a few hours. So he started the truck,
and as he pulled out onto the road, his cell phone rang. He answered it, and a man spoke and said his name was Charlie, and that he had heard Jack did some work, hauling stuff away, and that, he had this new barn that really needed to be cleaned out, and could Jack do it? Jack said sure, he could actually do it that afternoon. And then he grabbed his logbook off the passenger seat, and he flipped to a blank page, and he scribbled down Charlie's name and address, which was in Deerfield, almost 30 miles away. Jack told Charlie he would let him know as soon as he was on the way, and then the two men hung up. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Jack drove down a very secluded 2-lane road in Deerfield. It was sweltering outside, and he was already exhausted and dripping with sweat from his trash disposal gig that morning. He had no idea what to expect going into this barn cleaning job with this guy Charlie, but he was hoping it wouldn't take too long. Jack slowed down as the trees to his right parted, and a gravel driveway appeared. He turned onto the driveway, and a few seconds later, he pulled up right outside of a white 2-story house with a big barn out back. Jack parked his dump truck and walked right up to the front door. He rang the doorbell, and a moment later, the door opened. 2 days later, on the afternoon of June 29th, Jack's daughter, Megan, and her boyfriend, Walter, walked up to the front door of Jack's trailer. Megan noticed that Jack's dump truck was not parked outside, which seemed wrong, and so she immediately felt this knot in her stomach. About an hour earlier, Megan had gotten a call from her mother, Virginia, saying that Jack had not shown up to a job that morning and he was not answering his phone. This was unlike him, so Megan had said that she and Walter would just go over to his trailer and make sure he was okay. Now, initially, Megan had assumed her dad had just overslept or maybe forgot about the job. But now, it looked like he'd actually left for work because the dump truck wasn't there, but never actually made it to the job. But nonetheless, Megan knocked on the trailer door, just to be sure her dad really wasn't home, and there was no answer. And so at this point, Megan called her mom to tell her what she had seen and, the fact that her dad wasn't here. And she also told her mom that she was starting to feel pretty worried. And then a few minutes later, Virginia pulled up in her car. Megan, Walter, and Virginia all just stayed there right at the trailer all afternoon, hoping that maybe Jack would just show up at some point. And the whole time they're calling him over and over again, but it just kept going straight to voicemail. And then finally, around 6:30 p.m., when still they had not seen or heard from Jack, they decided it was time to call the police. On Tuesday, July 5th, so 6 days after Jack was reported missing by his family, Derry Police Detective Mike Hoole pulled into the parking lot of a Target store about an hour's drive south in Saugus, Massachusetts. Hoole slowed down and began to sort of slow roll through the rows of cars, keeping an eye out for one particular vehicle. Hoole was in charge of Jack's missing persons case, which had not really been going anywhere so far. According to his family, the last time anybody had seen or heard from Jack was actually on June 27th, so 2 days before he was reported missing to the police. But his family could not think of anywhere Jack might have gone or anybody who might want to hurt him. So initially, Hoole had figured that Jack must have just driven off for some time alone, and that he would just come home sooner or later. But that morning, he'd gotten another call from Jack's daughter, Megan. She said the family had put up all these missing posters around town for Jack, and somebody had called her and said they actually saw Jack's dump truck at this particular Target in Saugus, more than 40 miles away from Derry. Now, this tip was unique enough that Hoole decided he would just drive out and take a look for himself. And now, as he slowly made his way towards the back of this parking lot, he saw it, a red and black dump truck parked near the back corner. So Hoole stopped his car and he walked over to look at this truck, and right away he saw the license plate confirmed this truck was definitely Jack's. When Hoole peeked in the driver's side window, though, he didn't see anybody inside. But there were flies buzzing around the back of the truck, basically the open section of the dump truck. There was something in there the flies were attracted to. And there was also very clearly a rotten, awful smell wafting out of the back of this truck. And so Hoole put on some gloves and he climbed up the side of the dump truck. Now, the actual bed of this dump truck was covered by a tarp. And so Hoole grabbed the tarp and he pulled it back, but he still did not have an unobstructed view because whatever was in the bed was also wrapped in plastic, and quite a bit of it. So he pulled out a knife and began cutting through the plastic. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole stood by as workers from the medical examiner's office loaded Jack's body into their van, and he was still wrapped up in plastic. Hoole really wanted to get a look at Jack's body to figure out how he died, but that would require cutting through all the plastic that he was wrapped in. and Hool knew he needed to leave all that intact for evidentiary purposes. So he'd just have to wait until the autopsy to find out the cause of death here. But from the way Jack's body had been disposed of, hidden in a parking lot 40 miles from his house, Hool was already guessing that this was 1, a murder, and 2, it was carefully planned, probably by somebody that Jack knew. Hool had already found out from the family that Jack had 5 children with 2 different women, and so he figured there could be some hidden tensions between any of them. But he also thought the murder could be tied to Jack's business. Now, as far as Jack's family knew, everything Jack did with his business was above board. But it's entirely possible that he might have gotten involved with sketchy people or maybe done something that made a client angry that the family didn't know about. Also, leaving Jack's dead body in the back of his own dump truck definitely seemed like a way to send a message. So, once the forensics team had taken photos and swabbed the truck for DNA and fingerprints, Hool pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened up the driver's side door. There was no blood inside the cabin of the truck, no sign of a weapon, and really nothing that struck him as unusual or helpful. That is, until he saw the logbook that was tucked into a pocket on the passenger side door. He reached for it, pulled it out, and began to flip through it, and he saw there was a list of all of Jack's appointments, along with the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the clients who had hired him. The last job that was recorded in this book was on the morning of June 27th, back in Derry, where Jack lived. Now, there were no other jobs noted down for that day, but a couple of pages later, on an otherwise blank page, Hool found an entry that Jack seemed to have scribbled down in a rush. It was just an address, 145 North Road, no town listed, and the name was just Charlie for the client. Hool placed the logbook inside of an evidence bag and he sealed it. And then, as he sort of looked around the area, he noticed all the security cameras on light posts all over the parking lot, and there happened to be one that was pointing directly at Jack's truck. Did you know that the average employer has to sort through roughly 250 resumes per job opening? Talk about time consuming. Well, if you're hiring, here's some good news. You can now review all of these resumes and applications much faster thanks to ZipRecruiter. And today, you can even try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/ballin. ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology finds qualified candidates quickly. And with ZipRecruiter's new feature, qualified candidates who are very interested in your job show up at the top of your list. You also get a feel for their personality. Candidates can tell you in their own words why they're interested in your job. No wonder ZipRecruiter is the #1 rated hiring site based on G2. Cut through the standard and get to the standouts with ZipRecruiter. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And now you can try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/ballin. That's ziprecruiter.com/ballin. Meet your match on ZipRecruiter. The next day, so Wednesday, July 6th, Hool was back at the precinct in Derry, reading over an autopsy report that had just been sent over from the Massachusetts medical examiner. The description in the report said that Jack had been severely beaten. He had broken ribs, skull fractures, and a softball-sized hole in the side of his head. His face had been so mangled that they'd actually had to pull Jack's dental records to confirm that it was actually him. Hool thought this level of violence definitely made this murder feel really personal, and it only made him more confident that Jack's killer or killers was somebody who knew him. Just then, Hool heard a knock at his door, and he looked up as an officer peeked his head into Hool's office and asked him to come take a look at something. So Hool stood up from his desk, and he followed the officer down the hallway to another room where a team of investigators were poring over that security footage from the Target parking lot. Hool watched over their shoulders as the investigators pulled up a specific clip, and he could see from the timestamp in the corner of the screen that this footage was from around 5:30 p.m. on June 27th, which was the day of the last job written in Jack's logbook. Once it was up on the screen, Hool nodded for the investigators to press play, and then he watched as the footage played on screen. And it showed Jack's dump truck pulling into the parking lot, followed closely by a white minivan. After Jack's truck parked, 2 people got out of the truck. And unfortunately, it was impossible to identify really anything about these people. They couldn't tell if they were men or women or man and woman. It was just totally unclear. However, there was one thing that was definitely true about these people, and it was what they were actually doing. They were clearly dumping Jack's body. One of them went around to the back of the dump truck and checked to make sure that tarp was secure, and then they both walked over to the white minivan, got in, and drove away. And so Hull's mind was racing now, because it looked like there were at least 3 people involved in Jack's murder. There were the 2 people that were just out and about, sort of dealing with the truck, and then whoever was driving the white minivan. But another unfortunate reality was this footage was so fuzzy that they couldn't even pull the license plate for that minivan. And Hull was naturally pretty frustrated by that. But then the investigator said there was actually one more thing he wanted to show him, and he pulled up another portion of security video. This one was from the evening of July 4th, which was 7 days after Jack's dump truck was left abandoned in the parking lot, and 1 day before police, i.e. Hull, found the truck parked in that lot. The investigator told Hull that this footage he was about to see was from a different security camera, which was positioned on the other side of the parking lot from where the dump truck was parked. And then when he hit play, he directed Hull's attention to one particular car pulling into the parking lot. Now, the angle on this car was much closer, so there was a lot more detail visible than in the first video. And as Hull watched, he saw what clearly was a young woman get out of the passenger seat and walk toward the store. Hull leaned in close and squinted, and he realized he knew this woman because it was Jack's own daughter, Megan. Later that day, Hull walked into an interrogation room in the Derry police station, where Megan was waiting for him. When Hull walked in, he made a point to shake her hand and smile, acting as friendly and sympathetic as possible. He did not want to let on that he was looking at her as a suspect, so he didn't mention that they had video of her in the same parking lot where Jack's body was found, just a day before they found it. But as they started talking, Megan actually brought it up herself, that she happened to have been in the exact same lot that her father was ultimately found in. She said she had been shocked when she found out, one, that her father was dead, of course, but also that he was dumped in that target lot. She had been there recently. She said her boyfriend Walter's sister lived in Saugus, and they had visited her for the 4th of July in an attempt to get their mind off their father's disappearance because at the time, he had not been found yet. Megan said they had unexpectedly decided to spend the night there, so they had driven to the nearest Target to get a contacts case. And when she said that, she just shook her head and said she couldn't believe her dad had basically been right there. She was so close to him. Hull had to admit, this story did not sound totally crazy. After all, in the security video, Megan didn't go anywhere near the actual part of the lot where Jack's truck was parked. But still, he had a hard time believing that this was just one big coincidence, especially because when he was reviewing what Megan had told the police when she had first reported her father missing, he realized that she had said she last saw her dad on the night of Monday, June 27th, when she and her boyfriend Walter had gone to his place to pick up an air conditioner. But now, Hull knew that was impossible, because the security video showed that Jack was already dead in the parking lot on the night of June 27th. So during this interview with Megan, Hull asked Megan again, when was the last time you saw your father? And once again, without missing a beat, she said it was the night of June 27th. Hull asked her if she was positive about the date, and she said yes, absolutely. So, without tipping his hand that he felt like for sure Megan was lying here, Hull let her go and immediately called in her boyfriend Walter, who had been waiting in the hallway. According to Megan, Walter was the one who actually drove her to that Target in Saugus. Hull wanted to question the couple separately so he could see if there were any contradictions in their stories. But when he spoke to Walter, Walter repeated the exact same things Megan had said about why they were in the area and why they went to that Target to get a contacts case. Walter also included the detail about the last time they saw Jack being the night of the 27th. So basically, Walter and Megan's stories are the same. But to Hull, the only thing he thought when he heard this consistency is that clearly what's happened here is Megan and Walter have rehearsed this story because it is their alibi. But they don't realize there was time-stamped security footage that would contradict it. The following afternoon, Hull sat at his desk, combing through a copy of Jack's phone records. He'd sent officers out that morning to interview all of Megan's family and friends to see if they knew anything that could really help them pin the blame on Megan. And they'd quickly learned that Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack did not approve. So Hull began to wonder, maybe the young couple might have killed Jack so he would stay out of their way. Now, Megan at some point here found out from her friends who were being spoken to that Clearly, Megan was being investigated, and Megan had already called Hool to revise her testimony. She was now claiming that actually the last time she saw her dad was on the night of the 26th, not the 27th. But Hool didn't buy that she and Walter had both made the same mistake about the date. They both seemed really confident when they said 27th. And so Hool was hoping that if he could just retrace Jack's steps on the day of his death, he'd find some proof that Megan and Walter were somehow involved. Hool had already called around to check on the last scheduled job in Jack's logbook, which was on the morning of June 27th. And that client had confirmed that Jack was definitely there, and security footage from the local dump had shown Jack dropping off the trash afterwards around 2 p.m. But that left about a 3-hour gap on the afternoon of June 27th where Jack's whereabouts were unaccounted for. And really, Jack had to have been killed sometime in that window. So now Hool hoped that Jack's phone records might help him figure out where Jack went after leaving the dump that afternoon. Hool had been able to match most of the phone numbers that Jack dialed or received calls from to contacts in Jack's logbook, except for one. On the morning of June 27th, he had gotten a call from a number that wasn't anywhere in his contacts list. And at 2:07 that afternoon, while Jack was finishing up at the dump and just a few hours before his dead body was left in a Target parking lot, he'd gotten a second call from that same number. And so now, Hool called that number, but it went straight to voicemail. So he called the cell provider and asked them to look up who this number belonged to. And he found out it was registered to a man named Charlie Waz. And suddenly, something clicked in Hool's mind. And so he reached over and he grabbed Jack's logbook and he flipped to the page where Jack had scribbled down that address, 145 North Road, and also the name Charlie. This Charlie may be the same Charlie who called from that unknown number. And also, this Charlie may have been the last person to see Jack alive. Or maybe Charlie was the one who killed him. The cell provider employee also told Hool that that number came from a prepaid phone, the kind you can buy at a convenience store and load minutes onto without signing up for a long-term contract, and that it had been activated on June 19th, just 8 days before Jack's murder. Hool asked the worker to send over a full copy of the prepaid phone call's records, and then they hung up. Then Hool logged onto the police database and looked up the name Charlie Waz, but he didn't find anything. No criminal records or driver's licenses or car registrations. And so Hool had a feeling that this had to be a fake name, that there was no Charlie Waz. And what seemed to confirm that even further was when he looked up that address, the 145 North Road that was in the book next to the word Charlie. There was no Charlie affiliated with that property at all. The owner of 145 North Road was somebody called Michael Connors, but that name didn't mean anything to Hool, and it certainly wasn't Charlie. So Hool stood up from his desk and he grabbed his car keys. It was time to go talk with whoever actually lived at 145 North Road. Did you know that Fast Growing Trees is America's largest and most trusted online nursery with thousands of trees and plants and over 2 million happy customers? They have all the plants your yard or home needs, including fruit trees, privacy trees, flowering trees, shrubs, and houseplants, all grown with care and guaranteed to arrive healthy. It's like your local nursery, but anywhere you live, and with more plants than you'll find anywhere else. I ordered an indoor plant, and the whole process was so simple. The website made it really easy to find what I was looking for, a Bambino fiddle-leaf fig plant, and checkout was so quick. It even shipped that Bambino fiddle-leaf fig plant right to my door. And when I received my Bambino fiddle-leaf fig plant, it looked great and was ready to go. And so overall, it was just a very smooth, hassle-free plant buying experience. So originally, my wife wanted the Bambino fiddle-leaf fig plant for her reading room, but I thought it was so sweet that I brought it to my studio, so it's mine now. And right now, Fast Growing Trees has great deals on spring planting essentials, up to half off on select plants. And listeners to our show get 20% off their first purchase when using code Mrballen at checkout. Offer is valid for a limited time. Terms and conditions may apply. Less than an hour later, Detective Hool pulled onto a gravel driveway at 145 North Road, the address of the secluded farm scribbled in Jack Reed's logbook. He parked his car and he walked up to the big white house and he rang the doorbell. and the middle-aged man who answered the door seemed very calm and composed, until Hoole showed him his badge. Then the man started acting really jumpy. As they stood in the doorway, Hoole asked the man if he was Michael Connors, and the man nodded and said yes. Hoole asked if he knew a man named Jack Reed, and Michael quickly said no. And when Hoole asked why his address was in Jack Reed's logbook, Michael stammered out that he didn't know. It seemed fairly obvious to Hoole already that Michael clearly knew more than he was admitting to. And so he asked Michael where he'd been on the afternoon of June 27th. And Michael, very nervously and very quickly, said that he had spent all day doing repair work at a friend's lake house 30 miles away, and he didn't get home until late that night. And then he gave Hoole the names of a few other contractors who were also working on these repairs, who could verify his alibi. So Hoole, without giving off how suspicious he felt of this guy, wrote down the contractors' names and contact information, and then, as calm as could be, he asked Michael if he could take a look around, both inside his house and outside. Michael, who looked pretty resigned at this point, nodded and said yes, and then he stepped aside. And so Hoole walked into the house and began walking from room to room. But he didn't see any blood or anything really obviously suspicious. But then he went outside and he found this muddy path that led over to the barn, which was only a short distance from the main house. And when he reached the barn, he opened up the heavy wooden door, and sunlight flooded in. Hoole stepped inside, and right away he was struck by how neat it was in here. He began looking behind the hay bales, and he shined his flashlights in the corners, and he bent down to examine the dirt and the straw on the ground, but it was like the barn was spotless, almost like the barn had recently been cleaned really thoroughly. When Hoole was done in the barn, he went outside and walked back towards the main house. And as he did, he saw Michael standing by the back door, staring right at him, like he had been really watching him closely as he was over at the barn. And so Hoole walked over to Michael, and very calmly, he asked him one last question. Did he know anyone named Megan Reed? And Michael said no, but the way he said it was noticeably less anxious, as if, for really the first time, he was telling the truth here. After that, as Hoole walked back to his car to leave, he thought that even though he hadn't found any hard evidence at this farm, Michael's weird behavior seemed to be saying a lot. Later that day, Hoole hung up the phone in his office, feeling very frustrated. He called every single one of those contractors who Michael had given him, and they had all confirmed his alibi. Michael had been doing repairs at his friend's house, 30 miles away, at the time of Jack's death. So Hoole figured that, Michael couldn't have been directly involved in the murder, but based on his very suspicious behavior, it seemed like he probably knew something had happened on his property, maybe while he was away. And this gave Hoole something to work with, because it could mean that at least one of Jack's 3 or more killers was close enough with Michael that Michael was willing to lie to protect them. But that was about all he had to work with. There was no obvious link between Michael Connors and Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter, who were still really his only real suspects. And so he was starting to think that maybe he'd been looking in the wrong direction, and that Megan and Walter maybe weren't involved after all. It was still only a few days into the investigation, and there were plenty of other potential suspects to dig into, like Jack's ex-partners and his adult children from his first relationship and all the other clients in his logbook. But just then, Hoole's fax machine whirred to life. The cell provider was finally sending over the call records from Charlie's prepaid phone. Once it was done printing, Hoole ripped the sheet out of the machine and began looking over the call log. The phone had only been activated a week before Jack's murder, and it hadn't been used at all since the evening Jack was killed. And every single call that had been made or received on that phone was to Jack's number, except for one. And when Hoole looked into the owner of that one other number, everything about the case began to fall into place. Based on those phone records, as well as interviews with the various suspects, this is what police believe happened to Jack Reed on June 27, 2005. That afternoon, while Jack's dump truck was pulling into the gravel driveway at 145 North Road, 2 of Jack's killers were inside of that house waiting for him. One of them was sitting on the couch, nervously tapping their feet, and then that killer looked up and saw their accomplice staring right at them, looking very annoyed, like, "Stop tapping your feet." And so they did. But just then, the doorbell rang. The calmer of the two killers walked over to answer it, while the more nervous one stayed on the couch. And the nervous one, they listened as the door opened, and they could hear the sound of their accomplice greeting Jack. And then a few seconds later, Jack walked into the living room. And the nervous killer, when they saw Jack, they kind of jumped to their feet and tried to act natural, but very likely they were acting incredibly nervous. But after a sort of awkward conversation between all three of them, they left the main house and they walked down that dirt path towards the barn. As they walked, the killer, who'd been very nervous, sort of hung back, walking a few steps behind Jack. And then as they got close to the barn, their heart began to pound. I mean, they'd rehearsed this a dozen times and they knew exactly what they had to do, but actually doing it was going to be the hard part. Then the doors to the barn opened up, and inside, Jack would have seen there were two more people waiting for him. But before Jack could react, the nervous killer leapt forward and tackled Jack to the ground. And then a second later, the nervous killer heard a loud thump and looked up to see one of their accomplices standing above them, holding a hammer that was now dripping with blood. The nervous killer climbed to their feet and looked down at Jack, who was now lying on the floor of the barn with a gaping hole in the side of his skull. It was so gruesome that the nervous killer had to go outside and vomit. And then when they came back inside, the other three had unrolled this big piece of plastic on the floor of the barn, and they were placing Jack's body in the center of it. Blood was still pouring out of his head, pooling into this big red puddle on the plastic. I mean, it was so awful. Then one of the killers grabbed the bloody hammer and said that if they could just stop Jack's heart, it would stop the bleeding. And so they raised the hammer and began pounding on Jack's chest. And after that, the bleeding did slow down. And the four killers worked together to wrap Jack's body in the plastic. Then, once he was all wrapped up, they carried him outside and loaded his body into the back of his own dump truck. The killer who had first answered the door, the calmer of the killers, got in the driver's seat of the dump truck. And the nervous killer, the one who had been tapping their foot, the one who had initially tackled Jack to the ground, they climbed into the passenger seat. The other two, the ones who had been waiting in the barn, climbed into a minivan, and they followed behind them as they drove all the way across state lines to Saugus, Massachusetts, more than an hour away. When they finally got to Saugus, they pulled into the first major parking lot they came across, a Target store. They parked the dump truck near the back of the lot, and then when they got out, the nervous killer double-checked the tarp to make sure it was secure, and then they, along with their calmer accomplice, walked across the lot to the white minivan, and they climbed inside. After that, all four killers drove all the way back to New Hampshire to clean up the barn, because the farm's owner, Michael Connors, expected it to be left in perfect condition. Now, Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, was not directly involved in the murder scheme. However, he did know that the mastermind of the murder was going to be using his property while he was gone. However, he would testify that he did not know what they were doing and just asked that they keep it clean when he got back. Ultimately, the reason he allowed his property to be used at all is because he was doing a favor to the mastermind of the murder, who was his longtime friend and business partner, and also the very same self-made Las Vegas millionaire that Jack Reed himself had viewed as this big success story, whose path in life Jack was hoping to emulate. The millionaire's name was John Brooks, and he believed that when Jack had helped him move, it was a job he had done for him a few years back, that Jack, during that move, had stolen some of his motorcycles and jewelry. Now, there was no evidence to actually back this up, but John Brooks was convinced, and he held a grudge. So in retaliation, a few months after the move, Brooks had sent his son Jesse to Jack's home to scare him. That's who Jack had spotted in the middle of the night on his property almost 2 years ago, the strange prowler who had literally called out to Jack by name. But when Jack came outside to confront him and literally fired a gun at Jesse, Jesse and his dad did not stop what they were doing. Instead, Brooks only got angrier, and he vowed to get revenge. So he'd sent 4 people out to New Hampshire to kill Jack. It was his son Jesse, Jesse's friend Michael Benton, who was not the same as the Michael who owned the farm, and the 2 other men who were named Joseph Vrooman and Robin Knight. All 5 men were eventually convicted of taking part in the murder. John Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robin Knight was also sentenced to life.
Michael Benton, not Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, so Michael Benton got 33 years to life. Joseph Vrooman was sentenced to between 17 and 35 years, and Jesse Brooks was sentenced to 15 to 30 years. He was released on parole in 2023. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One weekday morning in March of 1995, a man named Luther Charles sat on the porch of his parents' house in St. Louis, Missouri, while holding a newspaper. Both of Luther's parents were at work, but Luther was not, because he didn't have a job. In fact, he hadn't had a single job in the last 5 years. So Luther desperately wanted to be an actor professionally. And he'd spent the last 5 years, not working, but auditioning constantly and getting rejected over and over and over again. Now he was totally broke and living with his parents, but he had not lost the dream of wanting to be an actor. Now, Luther knew that a lot of people, at least outside of the acting world, thought that trying to be an actor was sort of a pipe dream. Only chosen few get to do that professionally at a high level. And that he, Luther, should be more realistic and just get a normal job, especially after 5 years of attempts that didn't work out. But he just couldn't bring himself to do that, because for him it was going to be acting or nothing. So on this particular morning, he was doing what he did almost every single day, which was flipping through the classified section of the newspaper, looking for any open calls for auditions. And as he scanned the page he was on, he saw one that caught his eye. It was for a musical that was being produced several hundred miles away in Ohio, but they had an open call for auditions that night. Now, at first, Luther was kind of confused about why producers from Ohio would place a call for auditions in a newspaper in Missouri. But then he saw that it was because these producers were trying to find a very specific kind of actor for what sounded like a very unique character. And Luther realized he could be what they were looking for. This could finally be his chance to get his big break. This was, of course, not going to be easy. Number one, he would have to drive today all the way to Ohio just to do this audition. But two, what it would take for him to get into this character, to do a good job and hopefully land this part, was going to take a lot. But after 5 years of near constant rejection, he was willing to try anything. A few minutes later, Luther got into the driver's seat of his car. He was carrying 3 things with him: a map to help him get to Ohio, an entire bottle of whiskey to help him be brave, and a hacksaw to help him get into character. That evening in Ohio, one of the producers of this musical sat in the front row of an empty auditorium. She'd spent the last several hours listening to hopeful actors read monologues and sing songs, and she knew there were still more people waiting to audition. So she called for the next person in line to come inside. And a moment later, a man stumbled out onto the stage, and when the producer saw him, she was just confused, because he seemed very wobbly, almost like he was drunk, and he had on this weird sort of costume where he had bandages wrapped around his head. And then, in a very slurred voice, this man said his name was Luther Charles, and he knew that this musical required a very specific kind of actor, and he had made sure that he was perfect for this part. The producer didn't understand what Luther was talking about, though. But before she could clarify, Luther, on stage, began unwrapping the bandages from his head. And when the producer saw what was underneath them, she began screaming for help. It would turn out that casting call in the newspaper that Luther read that inspired him to go here and do this contained a very unfortunate typo. What the producers of the musical were looking for were genuine, fearless actors. But what actually got printed was a call for, quote, genuine, earless actors. And Luther Charles was so desperate to land a role that he drove to Ohio, downed a bottle of whiskey, and then cut off both of his ears with that hacksaw, because he believed it would make him perfect for this musical.
Luther survived his self-inflicted injuries and later underwent psychiatric treatment. He did not, however, get the part. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. The strangest part isn't coming home. It's realizing you came back, but your mind didn't. You're trying to move through life doing everything right, work, family, responsibilities. But small moments feel off, and later you're left thinking, what's wrong with me? I also went through these exact same feelings when I left the military. My mind was very conflicted because the world sort of expected me to be normal, but it was like my nervous system still expected danger all the time. Trauma doesn't stay back there. It rewires you. It changes how you react, how you trust, how you love. But therapy can help break that pattern. BetterHelp makes that support easier to access. You fill out a short questionnaire and get matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a couple of days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch anytime. Join the 6 million plus people who have gotten help from BetterHelp, the platform you can trust. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On an evening in October of 2003, a woman named Tina carried a grocery bag down the hallway of a big apartment building in Harlem, New York. The hallway was narrow, with white tile walls and heavy metal doors and overhead lights that flickered. And as Tina stopped in front of her door, she caught a whiff of a familiar smell coming from across the hall in apartment 5E. It smelled like urine and rotting meat. Tina grimaced, but quickly set down her grocery bag and began sifting through her purse for her keys. But right as she found them, she heard footsteps coming down the hall behind her. She turned, and when she saw who was walking up the hallway towards her, she began to panic because it was Antoine Yates, the owner of apartment 5E, the stinky apartment. He was coming right down the hall, and he was carrying what appeared to be this huge sack that maybe looked like it was filled with sand or something. She didn't care, but she did not want to be near this guy. And so as fast as she could, she put the key in the door, opened it up, flew inside, grabbed her groceries, shut the door, and deadbolted it. Now, Tina did feel sort of guilty about being really obviously rude towards Antoine. I mean, Antoine had lived in this building for years, and at one point she had thought he was a nice guy. But lately, he'd gotten really weird, and she no longer wanted anything to do with him. First of all, there was that horrific smell coming from his apartment basically at all hours. And then there was the fact that Antoine basically stopped leaving the apartment altogether. Like he was basically in his apartment 24/7. As far as Tina could tell, he maybe left once a day, tops, for maybe like an hour a day. But other than that, he was like a constant presence across the hall. But beyond the smell and his reclusive nature, the most sort of alarming aspect of his recent weird behavior were all the random loud crashing sounds that Tina would hear coming from Antoine's apartment at all hours, even though from what she could tell, he didn't have any visitors ever. It was just him in there. Now, Tina had no idea what Antoine was doing in there, but she assumed whatever it wasn't good, but it wasn't her business. And so she decided that the best thing she could do was just stay in her apartment, make sure the door was locked, and hope at some point he stopped doing whatever it was he was doing. A couple days later, Tina went down to the lobby to check her mail. And when she did, she ran into a woman named Joyce who lived in apartment 4E, which was directly below Antoine's apartment. Tina said hello to her, and as she opened up her mailbox, Joyce came over and stood next to her with this sort of strange look on her face. Tina picked up on it and asked her what was wrong. And Joyce told her that last night she'd noticed liquid dripping down through her ceiling. And at first she thought it was maybe a burst pipe or an overflowing sink. But when she got a rag and went to clean it up, she realized it wasn't water. It smelled like pee. Then Joyce, she lowered her voice and leaned in close to Tina. And she said the pee wasn't the only weird thing. Sometimes late at night, when the building was quiet, she said she could hear what sounded like whimpering coming from the upstairs apartment, Antoine's apartment. And at this, Tina's heart began to pound. Now, she had tried to just kind of, mentally and physically avoid the whole Antoine situation, whatever it was. But now that she knew other neighbors were also noticing bizarre things like she she felt like she had to act. And so Tina said to Joyce that, you know what, we really ought to call the housing authority and see if they'd come out and investigate to see what was going on. But Joyce said she'd already tried that. She'd called multiple times, and so far, nobody had done anything. So Tina told Joyce that, okay, well, let's all get together, all the other neighbors, and go to the housing authority as a group, and maybe then they'd be taken more seriously. Joyce liked the idea, so the two women exchanged numbers, and then Tina went back up to her apartment. But the next day, before Tina had time to chat with any more neighbors, she came home from the store and walked into the lobby of the apartment building, and she saw Antoine on the floor of the lobby screaming in pain with two police officers huddled over him. He had these gaping wounds all over his arm and his leg, and there was blood all over the tile floor. Tina didn't know what to do, so she just hustled right past them through the lobby, made her way upstairs, and got inside her apartment. But once she was inside, her curiosity got the best of her, and she ran to the window to see if there was anything going on outside that could begin to explain what was going on with Antoine. And outside, she saw an ambulance pull up, and then moments later, paramedics loaded Antoine into the back of it, and they took off. After that, Tina basically sat there expecting any moment for the police to come barreling down the hallway and break down Antoine's door, apartment 5E, to finally put an end to whatever was happening inside of there. But she sat there waiting for an hour, and she didn't hear anything. And then finally, after, about an hour, she saw those two police officers from the lobby get back in their squad car and drive away. Tina was shocked. She had no idea what happened to Antoine, but she also couldn't conceptualize of what Antoine would have told those officers that would make them think they should just leave without checking his apartment. And so Tina felt like she couldn't just sit here and do nothing, like somebody needed to go in there. Tina didn't know if maybe Antoine was hurting someone in his apartment and they had finally fought back, that's why he was all cut up, or maybe if he was involved in some kind of violent criminal activity or what, but it was clearly never going to end unless she spoke up. So, as much as it terrified her to get involved here, she picked up the phone, called the police, and told them everything she had seen and heard. The next day, Tina was coming home from work when she saw this huge crowd gathered outside her apartment building. Hundreds of her neighbors were just standing on the sidewalk looking up at the side of the building. And when Tina looked up, she saw what they were watching. A police officer was rappelling down the side of this building from one of the upper levels, and with him he had this big rifle and some other huge weapon, and he was slowly making his way down. But then he eventually stopped right outside a 5th floor window. And Tina realized he was stopping outside of Antoine's window. That was his apartment. And so Tina and the others watched as this officer began to tap on the glass of the window. And then there was this huge explosion of glass that flew outwards, like the window had broken, but from the inside going out. That officer immediately raised his rifle and began firing into the apartment while also signaling to the police officers above him, leaning out of another apartment to pull him up. And they immediately began pulling him up. And then a few minutes later, a half dozen more police officers came running out the front door of the apartment building, and they were carrying this massive tarp between them, with something obviously very heavy and large inside of it. Now, none of this made any sense to Tina, until the officers passed by her and she caught a glimpse of what was in the tarp. It would turn out Tina and Joyce were right to be suspicious of Antoine. But it wasn't because he was a violent criminal who was secretly hurting people in his apartment. No, his secret was actually much weirder. Antoine had a very strange pet. Specifically, he had a 400-pound tiger named Ming, who had been living in Antoine's apartment for years. It slept in one of his bedrooms with a giant sand pit. It peed basically everywhere, and it lived off raw meat. Antoine's horrible wounds that day were caused by Ming biting him when Antoine tried to stop the tiger from pouncing on one of his other pets, a stray kitten that he had taken in. As for Antoine and Ming, they both survived this encounter. Antoine was ultimately arrested for reckless endangerment, and Ming, who was just tranquilized during that exchange with the police officer, was carried out of the apartment and taken to a sanctuary in Ohio. Also, that stray kitten survived the attack as well. At 2:45 p.m. on January 6, 1995, a 45-year-old man named MacArthur Wheeler walked towards the front doors of a bank in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, which is a small town near Pittsburgh. MacArthur had on a mask and was dressed in a big blue parka, and in one of his pockets, he was carrying a semi-automatic handgun. MacArthur was about to rob this bank at gunpoint, but weirdly, he did not feel nervous, despite the fact that, MacArthur had never robbed a bank before. But one of his friends, 43-year-old Clifton Johnson, had. And Clifton was already inside the bank, waiting in line and pretending to be a customer, even though he was actually MacArthur's co-conspirator. MacArthur and Clifton had spent days planning out this robbery together, down to every last detail. And even though MacArthur had been kind of scared at first, Clifton had talked him through every possible scenario and made sure that they had a plan for everything that could go wrong. So now, MacArthur was 100% confident that they were going to get away with this, which again is why he was not nervous. So, this day, MacArthur walked up to the bank's doors and went inside. He had to squint through his mask because it obscured his view a little bit, but he saw Clifton standing in line, which immediately gave him another burst of confidence to actually see Clifton. He was here. So far, things were going exactly as planned. And so MacArthur quickly pushed his way through the line, and he locked eyes with the bank teller. And as he did, he pulled out his gun, he aimed it at them, and he told them to hand over all the money. MacArthur heard the sound of other people in the bank, other patrons and other staff beginning to gasp because they're seeing what's happening here. And so MacArthur quickly turned around with his gun still in his hand, and he told everybody that he didn't want to hurt anyone. Everybody just needed to stay calm, and as soon as he got the money, he'd be gone. Then MacArthur turned back to the teller, who by this point had gathered up all the cash in the register and was literally just holding it out, like, here, take it. And MacArthur, he grabbed the cash, put it in one of his pockets, he put his gun back inside of his pocket. Then he looked over at Clifton, and the two men nodded, and then they turned and ran out of the bank. About 3 months later, in the early morning hours of April 20th, 1995, MacArthur was sleeping inside his apartment just outside of Pittsburgh. After the robbery, he and Clifton had escaped with a little over $5,000, and they'd gone their separate ways in order to lay low. So they weren't really in contact, but to MacArthur, it seemed like everything had worked out perfectly, because here he was, still a free man with all this cash. And the cops hadn't even shown up once to question him. But on this particular night, a pounding on MacArthur's door woke him up. And he bolted upright in bed, and he heard somebody yell at him to open up, because it was the police. Now at this point, MacArthur was definitely nervous. However, he sort of calmed himself down and told himself that right now his best option was just to play it cool. Because even if the cops suspected him in that robbery, there was simply no way they could possibly prove he'd actually done it. He'd been wearing a mask and a huge parka that totally obscured his identity. So MacArthur, he got out of bed and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and sure enough, there's all these police officers standing in the doorway. And MacArthur pretended to act confused and asked them, what's going on here? And that was when one of the officers told MacArthur he was under arrest for armed robbery, and then showed him a printed photo from one of the bank's security cameras, and clear as day, there he was. So this photo clearly showed MacArthur's face. Every detail was perfectly visible. It was him, for sure. He didn't even look like he was wearing a mask. But MacArthur couldn't wrap his mind around how this was possible. He looked from the picture up to the cops and just said, "But I wore the juice." It would turn out the mask MacArthur was wearing during this robbery was not a ski mask or a Halloween mask or really a mask in any traditional sense of the word. What MacArthur and his co-conspirator Clifton had both done, and what they truly thought would disguise their identities completely, was rub lemon juice on their faces. They believed that lemon juice would essentially act as a mask and make them literally invisible to security cameras. Unfortunately though, lemon juice does not make you invisible. And so once the police accessed the bank's security footage, they saw clear as day MacArthur and Clifton committing this crime, and they arrested them both. Clifton was sentenced to 5 years in prison for armed bank robbery, and MacArthur was sentenced to 22.5 years. But this was not the end of the story, because Clifton and MacArthur's ridiculous crime made headlines, And before long, a professor of social psychology at Cornell University read about it, and it made him realize something. The fact that MacArthur literally believed lemon juice would make him invisible, and he acted on that knowledge, or that supposed knowledge, to commit this crime, and then was shocked when it didn't work, that suggests a level of stupidity that is just exceptionally high. So high that this professor began to wonder if maybe MacArthur is so stupid, he actually doesn't understand how stupid he really was. And so this led the professor to research this idea, and he ultimately established a new psychological concept that we now call the Dunning-Kruger effect, which essentially says that the more incompetent a person is at something, the less likely they are to recognize their own incompetence. Basically, the dumber you are, the more confident you become.